episode 1, we looked at the way patterns, the book Song of Solomon, connect with narratives in David and Solomon's life, as well as the architecture in the temple that he built and the themes in his other writing. As a result, we discovered the way this book profoundly addresses problems in its time, as well as ours, and draws us into relationship with God, as well as the people around us. In episode 2, we looked at the book's story. To avoid getting any of the debates that most of the commentators have been in on this book, we picked a commentary that gave the simplest reading of the book, i.e., a sort of simple peasant romance story that anyone could aspire to. We did that because this book has possibly the deepest rifts of any Bible book in how it's interpreted. In this video, we're going to try and understand what features of this book lead to this problem, and get some understanding of why the book has them. Okay, so first, what is the conflict in the commentators? Some commentators are going to see the verses, even Ezra reads as comparisons with the king, as introducing the king as a character in the narrative. If you have a king and a shepherd both in love with a girl, then you have a love triangle. And for these commentators, the book is summarized by the speech that contains, if one were to give all the wealth of his one's house for love, it would be utterly scorned, and then seems to have all these critiques of polygamy through the metaphor of vineyard economics. For them, the book is all about the woman choosing poverty and love, rather than being rich but in a harem, and ultimately separated from the one she loves. Others are going to see the king and the shepherd boyfriend as the same person. Obviously, both of these readings open huge cans of worms, and we're going to have to address these in separate videos about each of them. But in this video, we're going to talk about why biblical literature is occasionally ambiguous, and in a small number of cases, like this book, very ambiguous. A good place to start is the Gospels. The biblical authors want to be very clear about Jesus, say the same thing roughly 4 times in the 4 different Gospels. Of course, there's a small amount of variation, and you get a few really cool extra passages that Matthew seems to think are cool that maybe John isn't so interested in. The point is that the Gospel authors want to be ultra clear on the most important parts of the faith. However, in amongst all that clarity, Jesus teaches using parables. In his parables, he makes lots of really great and, again, really clear points. But these parables, these kind of dramatic stories, leave lots of room for ambiguity around the edges. So, for example, will the brother of the prodigal son join the banqueting feast? Jesus is not trying to make some kind of ultra-clear, systematic theology and failure. He wants to make every point he makes, and he wants to leave ambiguity wherever he leaves it. Why would Jesus do that? Ambiguity is going to make you pray for answers. It's going to make you read your Bible and look for answers. It's going to make you read commentaries and ask your pastor. So it draws you to Christ and it draws you to church. And via these connections, you're going to get conversations, relationships, as well as answers. Notice what I'm saying. The Bible has puzzles in it that are hard to solve. This doesn't mean that there is no solution, or that you can forget about the complexities of text and make up your own interpretation, but that God sees real value in giving you, the church, complicated ideas to chew over, discuss, and debate. Solomon is presented as the wisest person in history, and he likes to have fun with his reader. Proverbs is about getting wisdom, and the first third has an obvious structure but ends with a section that begins, wisdom has built her house. She has carved out her 7 pillars. Solomon never tells you what the pillars are, but because of that, he draws you and the commentators into the next section of the book, where you're presented with hundreds of short sayings about the benefits of different elements of good character and the costs of different elements of bad character. As a result, you and the commentators have to debate which of these potential pillars make sense as the foundation of a house. So, does diligence fit? Is diligence simply the absence of sloth? Is diligence equivalent to righteousness? Where does diligence come from? What causes you to develop it? And actually making the reader asks these questions is actually better than telling them what the 7 pillars are and ending the conversation. Ecclesiastes does this in a way that's a bit more like Song of Songs. You have this big long conversation, but you're never told who is speaking or where one speech ends and the next begins. It's a conversation all about doubt and despair, contrasted with the goodness of God. Part of what it's teaching you is how to deal with your doubts and how to listen to people who are doubting. It's brilliant. You might think that the faithful voice is just going to end up saying the opposite of what the doubting voice says. It's going to say, God made everything. It's perfect. But the faithful voice listens to the doubts and comes to the conclusion that there really are terrible issues in the world. But rather than turning away from God, these cause us to turn away from the world and put our faith in God. A bad way of reading this book is to think that this was a dialogue and Solomon just forgot to write who says what. Part of the point is that this could be a huge multiplicity of conversations, all taking this shape from one person's inner monologue as they deal with doubts and fears, or maybe half a dozen elders in the gate. Actually, this is a really important theme in Solomon's books we haven't touched on yet. Becoming one, multiplicity and unity. In the book Proverbs, he seems to be taking all these little observations and turning them into a single way of thinking about the world. In Ecclesiastes, he's taking all these contrary worldviews and showing us how they point towards this central conclusion. In Song of Songs, it's this story about people getting married and becoming one flesh. Notice that. Two people becoming one. Part of what makes Songs of Songs so hard to talk about is that it uses this ambiguity in a really extreme way. Is the king a hero or a villain? And who does the heroine end up with? To start seeing what we mean, look at this pair of verses, 6, verses 4 and 5a. You are beautiful as Tisra, my darling, as lovely as Jerusalem, as majestic as troops with banners. Turn your eyes from me, they overwhelm me. This is normally read with the male voice, but if we imagine the woman interrupting the speech, it doesn't get less romantic. You are as beautiful as Tisra, my darling, as lovely as Jerusalem, as majestic as troops with banners. She replies, turn your eyes from me, they overwhelm me. As an exercise, you can look through chapter 6 or one of the other speeches and try and spot ways you could break up the lines differently between the characters and think about what makes the rest the most sense in terms of the whole book. What's the point of this kind of ambiguity in Song of Songs? Adoration is the foundation of love, and provided a couple have this mutual adoration, it doesn't matter who is overwhelmed by whose eyes. Adoration is the foundation of love, and provided a couple have this mutual adoration, it doesn't matter who is overwhelmed by whose eyes. Now you can use this as a springboard for understanding the bigger ambiguities. Whether you're a king or a shepherd, a man or a woman, your romance begins with private adoration. She says, oh, that he would kiss me with repeated kisses. Then, as if he were listening to her, she says, for thy love gladdens the heart more than one. As it crescendos, you choose each other above all others and have these interchanges of mutual adoration and your love climaxes. I'm not saying that all these interpretations are equally valuable, or that there is no right interpretation, but that God gives you texts that you have to struggle with so that he can make you strong. To do this, you'll have to focus on words and sentences and paragraphs and try to develop the skill of reading or listening closely, putting down your preconceptions and trying to imagine yourself in the world of the characters. Developing empathy with them and learning to listen to them in the way that they speak is going to help you develop empathy in real life and help you learn to listen. If you do this with the story of the prodigal son we mentioned earlier, it's going to give you a new approach to grievance, entitlement, and forgiveness. And that's going to transform you from the inside out. If you do this with Song of Solomon, it will teach you a new way to rejoice over your other half or God. Who knows what the limits of the transformation that could bring? In the next few videos, we will start unpacking what happens if you read this book as a love triangle, and what happens if the king and the shepherd are somehow the same person. See you soon.